be 15 minutes. No, pretty short. But you do have a long CV now. All right, good morning, everybody. Wow, that's a little loud. Okay. I know you can hear me. Good morning. Welcome to the Robert Family Entrepreneurship Speaker Series. I think, as all of you know, this series was made possible by a donation and the generous support of Edward W. Robert. Their endowment gift advances entrepreneurship and innovation at U of O and the Knight campus, and we're really grateful for their commitment to help us foster the next generation of innovators, translating ideas into real-world solutions. And I don't think you're the new generation anymore. These are all the new generation that you're talking to. It's my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Cambre Kelly. This is actually her second visit to U of O and the Knight campus, although the first time we were, I don't know, were we even a hole in the ground? I guess.
Your office was a trailer?
It was a trailer. My office was a trailer, so yeah.
You've upgraded massively.
Yeah. Humble beginnings. Dr. Kelly is a biomedical engineer, entrepreneur, inventor, a nationally recognized leader in additive manufacturing and medical technology innovation. She's co-founder and CEO of Reselute, a company developing advanced localized drug delivery technologies to treat orthopedic implant infections. Obviously, this is an area of huge unmet clinical need. She also co-founded Restore 3D, which many of you have heard me talk about before, a pioneering MedTech company focused on personalized orthopedic implants and regenerative technologies. Dr. Kelly earned her PhD in biomedical engineering from Duke University. Her research focused on the design and characterization of advanced porous biomaterials for tissue engineering and orthopedic applications. Her work led to many publications, patents, and translational technologies at the interface of engineering, medicine, and entrepreneurship. In addition to multiple successful startups, Dr. Kelly has been recognized as a Forbes 30 Under 30 honoree in industry and manufacturing, received Georgia Tech's 40 Under 40 distinction, and was recently selected as a fellow in the Aspen Institute's Henry Crown Leadership Program, which I didn't know about, but it's a pretty big deal. You just got back from South Africa as part of that, which is pretty cool. So today she's going to share her insights from her journey building MedTech companies, translating research into products that improve patient care, and what she's learned about leadership, innovation, and entrepreneurship along the way. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Cambre Kelly.
Oh, that was really nice. Thanks, Bob. Excited to be here today to chat with y'all. When Bob invited me to give this talk, I started trying to think about how do I summarize, kind of my experience in my career and put that into some lessons learned and kind of pass on in the way that was kind of passed on to me, where are the potholes and how to avoid those so that the next generation doesn't fall into the same kind of issues and we can solve different problems. So I'm a huge fan of NPR and particularly Guy Raz and his podcast, How I Built This. It's something that I feel like is kind of an entrepreneur's Bible in a lot of ways. And a question that he asks every founder or entrepreneur that he interviews on that show at the end of the interview is, do they attribute their success to luck or hard work? And as you can imagine, these are, founders and entrepreneurs kind of spanning all sectors. I think the first episode was Sarah Blakely, the founder of Spanx, who I admire a lot. And so the kind of variety of answers is wide, right? And most people kind of, concede that it's some combination of luck and hard work, right? And I think that's ultimately where a lot of us would say we land. But I oftentimes reflect in kind of different seasons of my journey, is it more luck or hard work? And so this talk is kind of a product of me reflecting on that, at least where I sit today in my entrepreneurial journey. So first, if we're going to decide if it's luck or hard work or something else that makes a startup successful, we've got to decide what is it that makes a startup successful, right? And I think the first thing is that it doesn't die. That's, I think, pretty important, right? And there's kind of an adage in our entrepreneurial ecosystem, the only way a startup really dies is that it runs out of money, right? You can say that you hit some roadblock where you can't get the product through FDA or market adoption doesn't go the way you want, but those aren't ultimately the cause of death. The cause of death for a startup is that it runs out of money, and so it's very important to be thinking about that as, founder, CEO constantly. I think a more aspirational view of success is that the startup achieves its vision or goal for making something better. If you ask entrepreneurs, you're never going to get an answer that says that we want to make something that's the status quo. We want to make something that's mediocre, right? We are endeavoring to do the hard things that we do because we want to bring something better into the world. And in the world of MedTech, we want to do it to bring something better to patients, right? And so that's what's motivating us and the North Star for a lot of founders. If you ask our investors, they're going to say a successful startup is one that produces a nice exit, right? And you can argue, should that be a 3x or a 5x or a 10x exit? But returning capital to shareholders and hopefully to the founders and the team is a really important metric of success. And this is something that, you think about not only for the success of the startup itself, but for the success of the ecosystem. And so when you think about capital returns and kind of a rain cycle of capital that comes back around, when a startup is successful and produces a substantial return, that fund will grow the next fund and invest in the next generation of startups and entrepreneurs. And this is something that I've seen throughout my career where that kind of keeping the capital rain cycle flowing is extremely important to the ecosystem. And lastly, we employ, train, and inspire a next generation of entrepreneurs. This is something that I spend a lot of my bandwidth now thinking about and hoping that the teams that I'm building at both Restore 3D and Reselute now are the next generation. And this is a byproduct of a lot of mentorship that was poured into me to get me to where I am in my career, which I'm extremely thankful for, and me hoping that I can do some more of the same and pay it forward. So as long as we all agree on these are the four metrics of success of a successful startup, I'd love to spend just a little bit of time telling you guys about my career in both academic and commercial stage startups, and kind of how I've gotten to where I've gotten to in this perspective. So I've been about 15 or more years as a biomedical engineer and working in 4 different MedTech startups now with a little hiatus in corporate America, which I'll talk about, but always working to solve unmet clinical needs using innovative university-based technology and taking that into private startups through both development and ultimately into commercialization. So I'll just kind of walk you through the kind of linear timeline of my experience and some of the lessons I've learned along the way and the technologies and the products that we've developed. So I started at Georgia Tech. Maybe that was one piece of kind of first luck. I am from the Atlanta area originally. And for those of you that aren't familiar with the state of Georgia or Georgia Tech, we have a program that is a state lottery-funded scholarship called the Hope Scholarship. And so that piece of luck of being an in-state student in Georgia forced me into going to Georgia Tech, basically, because it was a free, full-ride scholarship. And I honestly didn't know what an engineer was. At the time I was applying to Georgia Tech, I applied as biology pre-med, and then ultimately became kind of aware of what biomedical engineering was and really fell in love with the idea of basically being a professional problem solver. So the first little piece of luck is the Hope Scholarship. There's a really good joke that if you don't maintain a certain GPA, you lose hope, which is something you never want to happen either metaphorically or with your scholarship. So that was probably a first piece of luck that really set me on this journey at being at Georgia Tech. And that led to my first job in med device and orthopedics at a business called MedShape. So that was a spin out of Georgia Tech. And I basically got that job because I was curious and a little bit nosy, if I'm being honest. I was sitting in a lecture hall kind of seminar just like this, not paying attention to the professor that was lecturing for class, and talking to a friend that was sitting next to me, was also not paying attention and working on a product marketing brochure for a product that MedShape was developing. And I leaned over and said, "Hey, Victoria, what class is that for? That looks like a kind of cool project." And she said, "Oh, no, this is for my co-op." I said, "Well, what's a co-op?" So she'd explain that to me and then kind of put my resume in the stack to be in the next class of co-ops, which is kind of an internship program you go back to. And so that got me my first job in medical device. And I learned over kind of a couple different co-op terms working with that team, the basic science side, how do we take that through regulated quality management system and design controls, working with FDA, How do we think about this from a sales and marketing standpoint? How do we interact with surgeons to solicit their feedback? And it really just ignited in me this passion for translational research and bringing those products to market. So it's kind of my first taste of what that could look like. The team at MedShape was about 30 when I was working there, and so it was this really amazing energy where everyone was wearing different hats, and I got to experience, kind of the whole life cycle and have a lot of responsibility, really quickly as a, glorified intern essentially. So it was a really pivotal experience for me. MedShape was developing primarily shape memory materials for extremity indications. So I'll just kind of give you one hero example of the products that we were working on developing and are still being developed by that team today. So kind of one unmet clinical need that we were focused on was hindfoot fusion. So there's an extremely high rate of failed fusions in these patients, particularly those that have comorbidities. So think Charcot neuropathy, which is a complication from diabetes, or they're smoker, other things that make them kind of type B hosts, and their bone is really reticent to heal. And so the technology innovation here was a nitinol shape memory technology that was provided as an internal element inside an intermedullary nail. And so this goes into the patient's hindfoot. It's inserted through the calcaneus. And by having that nitinol element there, we took what was previously kind of just a static metal rod that provided some stability, and we were able to use the superelastic nature and shape memory properties of that nitinol to provide sustained dynamic compression across the joint. And for those of us that work in bones and bone healing biology, we know that compression and that mechanical reaction is extremely important. And so ultimately, the clinical outcome for this technology and those indications is drastically improved fusion rates and ultimately patient quality of life, reducing the number of surgeries and revision procedures that these patients need. So an incredible application of this material technology into a massive unmet clinical need. That business was ultimately acquired by Enovis in 2021. And I was just visiting the old MedShape offices, now the Enovis offices. It's all still there. They're still developing new products and continuing to use this platform technology in other indications in orthopedics, which is very, very cool. So next, after MedShape, maybe another lesson that I learned here quickly is that a bad luck turn can sometimes be actually fortuitous, and so when one door closes, another one opens quite often. MedShape ran into some financial issues in kind of 2018, 2019, while I was still a co-op there, and they had to cut the co-op programs. There's a very funny story about me getting fired by the now CEO of Restore 3D, who I still work with, but like I said, when one door closes, another opens, and I had the opportunity to start working at Vertera Spine, which was another Georgia Tech spinout. It was even smaller, pre-regulatory. It was a team of 4, including Stephen LaFoon, which I think some of you guys know. And we were developing a porous peak technology. So it was a very small team, and I, again, had a ton of responsibility supporting grant writing and execution, which became kind of a technical skill set that has served me extremely well over the course of my career. Working on regulatory filings in the first 510K to FDA, and what's the strategy, how do we package this together, this new technology, this new material in a way that FDA can understand and ultimately get comfortable with. What does it look like to fundraise, for a business at this stage? How do we think about spinning out of the university, all of those sorts of things. So it was a ton of really fun, but really hard work for me at that point, and just kind of really reinforced my interest in this space. And so, like I said, Vertera was developing a porous peak technology, which we applied in spinal fusion indications. So there are pretty poor fusion rates in spinal interbody fusion. So when you have degeneration of the discs between your vertebral bodies, you oftentimes need this fusion procedure to basically open that disc space back up and put a spacer cage in there. When patients have a degeneration in your cervical spine, you end up with kind of pain and tingling and weakness in your arms, and then in your lumbar spine, pain, weakness, tenderness in your legs. And so we started with the cervical indications and had this thesis that a porous PEEK cage, and PEEK is a hard plastic that's often used in these indications, would improve those fusion outcomes. Surgeons were using what's called smooth PEEK, or they would have plasma spray coating on the PEEK to try to get some interdigitation between the bone and the implant surface, but oftentimes you would get kind of poor fusion rates there, and that micromotion would then lead to the need to revise the procedure. And so we thought if we could get bone to grow into the implant, we could get better outcomes, and ultimately that hypothesis was proven to be true. So we launched a suite of products. The Cohere cervical cage is the one that's shown there in the middle of the screen. And you can see the histology that shows kind of the difference as the bone starts interdigitating with the implant. Ultimately went on to do some great clinical research to show improvement in patient-reported outcomes. The NDI score is kind of a common PRO that's used in patients that have this procedure, and showed, a significant and clinically meaningful improvement in those patient outcomes longitudinally out to 12 months post-op. So a really amazing technology, a really cool manufacturing process. And ultimately that technology and business was acquired by Nuvasive in 2017. And they've taken that and expanded what we were doing in the cervical space into lumbar and kind of a whole product portfolio. So that takes me through when I kind of wrapped up my undergrad journey, and I took a little bit of a detour, like I mentioned before, into corporate America, if you will, for a handful of years, and took a role at Accenture as a technology consultant. And in this role, I learned a lot. I learned that it's important to find out what you're passionate about, but also what you're not passionate about. And I was not passionate about being a technology consultant. I learned pretty quickly. But I did learn a lot of skills, particularly soft skills, in that role that have continued to serve me. At Accenture, I was working on real-world evidence platforms, primarily for pharmaceutical clients. So this was at an age when kind of cloud computing and these sorts of things and real-world evidence was really very early. So we were doing some really interesting things, but I kind of started to miss working on something tangible. And I kind of quickly realized that I wasn't going to make a good consultant for very long. I was kind of looking around at some of the senior leaders on the team and realized that I didn't aspire to be them, which is a pretty good sign that you're probably not in the right seat. And then as part of our kind of standard performance cycle, they had us do this Gallup Strength Finder assessment. And my top strengths were like learner, innovator, things that I wasn't doing in that role. And it was a little bit of a wake-up call to me to say, when I take a step back and realize I might have, taken a little bit of a detour here, but what are the things that do excite me and light me up, and how do I get back to doing something, in my day-to-day that kind of feeds those passions? So kind of took a step back from that and ended up applying to grad school and ended up at Duke for my PhD. And all of my PhD research was focused on 3D printed materials, like Bob mentioned. What Bob didn't mention is he was my co-advisor for my thesis. And so we spent a lot of time thinking together about these unmet clinical needs and how we can use 3D printing and porous lattices to achieve some of that. But the luck in this kind of phase was really in the timing. And Bob and I were talking about this in his office a little bit this morning. When I joined Duke in 2017, we received the first laser powder bed fusion production system that had been landed in the US. There were maybe 7 installed in Europe, and our machine was serial number 8. So this machine landed actually a couple years before I joined the lab at Duke, and it didn't really work, if I'm being completely honest. It was kind of a hunk of junk for a while. So really dialing in this printer that was not this plug-and-play commercial system took a lot of effort, and ultimately when I joined the lab and started using it, it was running at least, but it really needed to be optimized. And so it's crazy to see the application of that technology in 2017, and the literature was very hypothetical, and nobody was really talking about using it for orthopedics, or at least not large segmental defects and patient-specific design. It was really more about lattice structures and, like I said, kind of hypothetical coupons. And so I feel very grateful that the timing there was really the sweet spot of that technology kind of coming to a maturity level, but still being really early enough that we could pioneer something. And so ultimately we started going, kind of an inch wide and a mile deep studying triply periodic minimal surfaces, which is quite a mouthful, and particularly a gyroid structure, which I'll talk about. And we produced a lot of really great research trying to understand those materials and how we could apply them to load-bearing indications in orthopedics. In the literature, they were being talked about as great lattices for typology optimization for heat exchange in aerospace because of their high surface area. And so we quickly connected the dots and said, okay, material with these great mechanical properties and high surface area probably has an application in orthopedics, and let's try to understand that a little bit more. But for those that are not familiar with laser powder bed fusion, here's kind of a quick video of what that looks like. We start with a medical grade pre-alloyed metal. This is Ti-64, but we also 3D print cobalt chrome as well for orthopedic indications. And then there's small kind of 30 micron size spherical powder particles. And then you basically sequentially layer over layer, use a laser to define your kind of 2D planar cut. And then you build up your parts over time, and you get to play kind of excavator at the end. You saw with the little paintbrush to remove the unsintered metallic powder away. And then you're left with these incredibly complex porous lattice structures or patient-specific designs or pretty much anything that you can make in a CAD model. And so it wasn't until this technology really existed that we could contemplate things like triply periodic minimal surfaces and ultimately the gyroid. So these structures are basically sinusoidal functions in 3D. So there's the math there for anybody that's really into geometry. But it basically produces these kind of sheet-based architectures. And like I said, these were really being talked about in the literature for aerospace indications. The math has been known since the late 1800s, and then they were being kind of studied by a scientist at NASA. You see that kind of first physical model was a vacuum-formed, kind of assembled gyroid. And then you fast forward, 50 years, and we can 3D print these architectures pretty easily. We can functionally grade them into each other. We just have such a, kind of wealth of design space that previously didn't exist before these 3D printing technologies. So again, kind of why now? I feel a lot of luck in the timing of our ability to kind of unlock these architectures because of where we got with the 3D printing technologies. And so we started studying these structures. We were looking at other strut-based architectures, but we quickly realized that, kind of from a porosity-dependent response, the mechanical properties of these sheet-based TPMS architectures were far superior than anything else we could 3D print. And so we started with some pretty basic, just static compression testing, and you see those black circles are the sheet-based architectures, which kind of preferentially have a higher mechanical response at any given porosity. And so this was kind of our first insight of, there's something pretty interesting here that we want to double click on and explore. And then we started looking at, does the printing orientation introduce any isotropy or anisotropy rather to the system that we need to be aware of when we think about turning these into not just kind of cylindrical coupons, but ultimately, kind of complex 3D printed parts for implants. And what we realized is that the gyroid system kind of had a pretty indifferent response. It was really isotropic, and that became very interesting, not only for kind of freedom from a manufacturing perspective, but ultimately when you think about 3D printed patient-specific implants, our engineers now don't have to think about where are we applying lattice and how is it being printed, in what orientation. We have a ton of kind of unbounded design freedom when we think about that because of this property of the structure. We looked at fatigue properties, both compression and tension, and proved that we had a superior fatigue performance relative to kind of strut-based architectures. This was attributed to kind of the continuous nature of the sheets, which don't produce kind of defects or other kind of cleavage points that become notch sites for fatigue initiation. And then we did a really cool animal study. So this is when I was out here in Eugene last. There's Bob there in the OR. We did a segmental femoral defect study in rodents to prove that we could heal segmental defects in this model. And this was kind of our first indication that we could translate this, right? So this was a really important kind of step for us to see in a model that Bob and the Goldberg lab had developed over, many years, that we could plug in and get great results. We followed that up with some additional studies in large animal, looking at the kind of porosity-dependent response of the implant bone interface, and kind of proved out that there was an optimized kind of ideal point of porosity at about 70%. And so that's ultimately the version of the gyroid structure that we brought in to our commercial products at Restore 3D. So while I was a grad student, actually within the first semester, we founded a business called Restore 3D, which is using this 3D printing technology for patient-specific implants. And so I was wearing two hats. While I was a PhD student, I was PhD student and co-founder, trying to bring products to market. And it was an incredibly fulfilling experience to have my aims of my research very much aligned with what the business needed to understand to bring these products, ultimately through development and FDA and into commercial use. So everything was very applied, and very much as we were learning things in the lab, we were actively translating them into the business, which is an incredible place to be as a PhD student who is there to not just write papers, but to do science that ultimately was going to have application. And so I've been learning a lot of lessons at Restore 3D for the last almost 9 years. One lesson that I've been learning in the last couple of months is that what oftentimes is a ton of hard work looks like good luck from the outside looking in. And so I think it's an important lesson to know that people that are not down in the weeds with you will have a very small glimpse of what it takes to get from where you were to where you are. And they will think that luck probably had more of a factor in it than you do. And so we're oftentimes called the overnight success at Restore 3D, but what people don't know that it's been 9 years of being the overnight success. And that there were some years where we didn't feel very, very successful. So that's just kind of a bar chart of our revenue. You can see in 2018 when we started doing cases, there wasn't very much revenue, and we've been able to grow that over the last 9 years, but it wasn't some hockey stick, growth on the second year. It took a lot of time and a lot of diligence to build the business to where we are today. And so it's a lot of sustained effort. There were a lot of people that told us we couldn't do it. And I'm personally motivated by having a chip on my shoulder. So every time someone says that to me, it fires me up. So, we had to overcome a lot of roadblocks, and we built a team that perseveres. That's incredibly important. And that the team is, unilaterally motivated by the impact that we have on patients, and that's a huge part of how we think about marketing what we do at Restore 3D, not only externally but internally, as we think about recruiting and retaining our team and motivating everyone to do the hard work that we do. So at Restore 3D, the unmet clinical need is that we've got a ton of anatomic variability, but a pretty one size or a few size fits all approach to serving these patients. So we're focused on joint replacement primarily. We do total hip, knee, ankle, and shoulder arthroplasty. And so to just kind of give you an example, this is a scatter plot of 85,000 human knees from CT data, and we're just looking at kind of two dimensions here, the femoral medial lateral width and then the femoral AP width, right? So these are just basically like the planar dimensions of your distal femur. And you can see there's a ton of variability. There's kind of obviously a male-female kind of signal here. But the problem is these black data points represent all the standard knee implant sizes from the 5 largest orthopedic manufacturers. And so you can see pretty quickly there are a lot of patients that are kind of being left out of design intent here. And why should a patient settle for, something that is a handful of millimeters too small or too large for them? And this is oftentimes what surgeons have to do, is kind of make compromises in sizing the implants when they're using kind of standard sizing. And so at Restore 3D, we think every patient deserves personalization. Like I said, we operate across kind of all the major arthroplasty verticals. We've also started doing some work in trauma and oncology, particularly where there are large bony defects that need to be spanned, and we can provide graft cages for. And then we've also started doing a little bit of work in patient-specific design for CMF indications as well. So for us, this is a huge addressable market, but we think something that, patients and ultimately surgeons are very excited for and should be the standard. And so all of that research on the gyroid that I was talking about when we were at Duke has kind of turned into our title technology, which we use as our bony implant interface for all of our implant systems across the body. And just to give you a sense of kind of the clinical outcome, this is one of our patients, Kimberly. I'll kind of let you hear in her own words what a personalized solution meant to her.
When something big happens to you, you're always saying, am I ever going to get back to the old me? That's like a huge question when you have a life-changing incident. My knee was replaced in 2020, and that was off the shelf. And I don't feel like it was right for me. I had a lot of trouble afterwards, and I had no idea this Restored 3D was even out there when Dr. Campbell just explained the process. I mean, him telling me how he was going to prepare for this, and the other doctor telling me he could schedule me for a week, I said, this is a crazy difference, and I asked for a second opinion. And then Dr. Campbell just made me feel so comfortable, so confident. It was like I wanted to get it done. I didn't have the apprehension, that I had had for so many years, like what's going to happen next and how's it going to feel and am I still going to be able to walk? When we met with the engineers, the two guys that were personally involved in my ankle, designing and building, they showed me how they lined up my ankle with the way my knee was. And I have said many times already, it has helped my knee. The knee that I've had trouble with for 4 years after the replacement, that feels better along with my ankle. So to me, that was a big surprise. So to me, it's a no-brainer. And I can't even see having somebody just pick a piece. It just doesn't even make sense to me now. When I got out of the boot and I started moving around, I even said to my husband, I said, wow, this just feels totally different. There was no pain in there, in the joint, which was a real big part of the pain. And I could just feel it move smoothly. And to me, that was exciting to begin with. And I said, well, I really think this is going to turn out good. I'm walking a lot. I've been weed whacking. I don't think he wants me pushing the lawnmower yet. He doesn't want me to go all guns, but hiking, hiking around a lake, and I'm just very satisfied with how my ankle's working for me.
So for us, this is why we do what we do, right? We do patient experience days where we bring patients like Kimberly and their families into our office. We show them the 3D printers that we use to make their implants. They get to sit with the engineers that help design their patient-specific implants. And it's incredibly powerful for our team to kind of see that impact directly, and continues to motivate us to do what we do. In orthopedics, we're in a patient satisfaction business, right? These are patient-reported outcomes, or the clinical metrics that we use to decide, did we do a good job with surgery? And we've been able to prove with long-term clinical outcomes and prospective and retrospective studies that patients that get personalized solutions do better. So we have the highest published patient satisfaction rate for our patient-specific total knee system, and the lowest revision rate in the UK registry, which is kind of a prospective registry that's run for all patients that get joint replacement in the UK. So we're extremely proud of the ability to not only offer these solutions, but prove that they are superior for the patients in the long run. We do some really cool stuff outside of arthroplasty too. We do a lot of what I call disaster plasty, which is patients that have crazy trauma or oncology or other defects. And so we have a custom device program where we can offer solutions that are really unique and that no other manufacturer can do. We've got an incredibly talented team of engineers and manufacturing team that can produce those implants and bring them to life. And so surgeons come to us with kind of the cases that are keeping them up at night that they can't think of a better solution for, as well as their kind of standard day-to-day arthroplasty practice. So To date, we've provided implant solutions for 160 unique bones in the human body, which we're very proud of, and more than 150,000 patients, which is really cool. And then that brings me to kind of my last startup that I'll talk about, which is a company called Reselute. This business spun out of some research that was done at Duke University by my co-founder Ken and a joint surgeon and another researcher for drug delivery technology, primarily focused on infection complications in orthopedics. And this is a massive unmet need. It's something that I've been hearing about since I was an undergrad working at MedShape. Surgeons are very, very concerned about what happens if my patient gets infected, what happens if my patient has a history of infection. And this is just an unmet need that's really been left unaddressed for too long. And so the lesson of luck that I learned here is maybe luck is what happens when preparation meets opportunity. Reselute is certainly my most ambitious endeavor to date, at least through a regulatory and clinical lens. It's a combination product because we are both an implant and a drug delivering drug. And so that necessitates kind of a different regulatory strategy and approach. It's a de novo marketing application that requires clinical trials. So this is something that there's a lot more burden kind of on the pre-market side than 510K products and what we've developed and the other businesses I've talked about. So certainly an ambitious kind of development strategy from that standpoint, but the origin story is quite funny. We originally licensed this technology to Restore 3D and applied for an NSF SBIR award. And despite receiving all excellence from the panel review, we weren't funded. And I called the program officer and said, what the heck, what's going on? I don't understand. And they basically came back and said that they were America's seed fund, and therefore Restore 3D had raised a Series B round at that point, and we were commercial, and therefore we didn't qualify, which, by the way, is nowhere in the solicitation. There's no qualifications about being a seed stage. And so, like I told you before, I am very motivated by having a chip on my shoulder. And I had about 10 days to incorporate Reselute, do a control find replace in the SBIR proposal and change Restore 3D to Reselute and reapply. But ultimately, that did result in winning that phase 1 SBIR award. When that notice of award came in, I was like, felt very validated and vindicated. And then I realized, well, crap, now I've got to run this other business. But ultimately, like I said, luck is what happens when preparation meets opportunity, and I felt extremely prepared to rise to the challenge of that opportunity. We took that technology, which had been developed at Duke with really the indication set being focused on periprosthetic joint infection, and ended up pivoting into trauma indications after doing an extensive customer discovery program that was run by NSF. As I mentioned before, this is a very large uphill regulatory and clinical pathway to bring a first-in-class drug delivery technology into this space. It's something that is pretty new to FDA, and so they're still trying to figure out what the guidelines and regulations should look like in this space as well. And then it's also been a pretty challenging time to be running a med device startup. It's a pretty austere capital environment out there right now. And so trying to figure out how do we position the business and how do we stay capital efficient and how do we continue to lean on non-dilutive funding to the extent that we can, given the volatility of non-dilutive funding these days, has been a new challenge for me, but something that I've been pretty excited about continuing to apply my expertise and learn new things. And so the unmet clinical need, like I mentioned, that we're focused on at Reselute is orthopedic infection rates. This is something that's widely acknowledged by clinicians, us in industry, FDA. FDA has hosted multiple workshops on this problem, but nobody's really solved this problem. And there's not a one-size-fits-all solution to this problem, but we're spending $5 billion a year on orthopedic-related infection complications in the US alone. And you can see the infection rates for what's called fracture-related infections, so kind of post-traumatic acute infections or periprosthetic joint infections are extremely high. In a patient that has an open tibial fracture, which is where we're focused, the infection rate can be as high as 40%, depending on kind of the soft tissue involvement and the grade of the fracture. So kind of an unacceptable complication rate, in my opinion. And what we kind of learned as we did customer discovery is that there was no product that provided both fixation and local antibiotic delivery, and surgeons were improvising, or what I call MacGyvering, solutions on the back table. So using a combination of PMMA, bone cement, or other degradable bone void fillers, and kind of dosing in their own cocktail of antibiotics based on their own experience or what their infectious disease service told them to use. And basically using off-label solutions to try to locally deliver antibiotic to these patients while mechanically fixing the fractures. And so that top right corner of the unmet need of robust fixation and sustained antibiotic delivery is where we're ultimately focused. And we are developing a product that we call our Resolution intermedullary system to fill that white space in that need. And so this kind of gives you a sense of what the value prop of that product is. We're focused on open tibial fracture indications to go to market first. And so there's some kind of demos, I think, floating around of both the Restore 3D products and the Reselute nail. And so it's basically an internal reservoir that contains a degradable carrier inside that permanent titanium implant that delivers antibiotic over a 6-week period. We use both vancomycin and tobramycin, so we have broad spectrum coverage above the minimum inhibitory concentration for that kind of 6+ week period, which is an incredibly clinically meaningful period of time given the kind of progression of these infections. It's a one-stage solution, so these patients get this implant and then they don't need subsequent surgery, which is a little different than some of the solutions that surgeons use today that necessitate a revision. And ultimately, it's an off-the-shelf and on-label solution for surgeons. Every surgeon, or every orthopedic surgeon learns how to do a tibial nail in residency, and so it's a solution that even if it's a spine surgeon that's on trauma call over the weekend, they should be able to implement this into their practice. So Reselute is still preclinical. I actually am waiting for my phone to ring. Today is day 30 of our IDE submission, so everyone cross your fingers for me that we get a positive approval from FDA later today. And so we will move into our clinical trial phase, hopefully later this year, to start studying this product in patients. So that kind of wraps up in, 36 minutes here, 15 years of kind of experience working in engineering and med device kind of across a handful of different companies. I'll just kind of wrap up and close out here kind of, Cambre's formula for success, if you'll indulge me. First, I think it's important to say that I don't think success is a byproduct or happenstance. I think you have to engineer it. And I think that that's something that people, again, the outside looking in, maybe don't experience firsthand. And so I think, at least in my opinion, I've established there's definitely a component of luck, timing, opportunity, walking through those doors when they're open for you, a lot of hard work. I can't underline that enough times. But I think there's some other components of it too. A thoughtful capital strategy is definitely part of engineering your success. So just kind of a couple thoughts there. It is always going to take longer and cost more money than you think it will to bring these products to market. And so I often say when you're fundraising, take the money when it's on the table. And a lot of founders get really concerned around dilution. And yes, this is something that we need to be thinking about to make sure that we share in the upside. But it's a lot better to have a smaller piece of a bigger pie than a big piece of a pie that doesn't exist anymore, in my opinion. So take the money when it's on the table, assuming the terms are not egregious, right? There's a really good book that I recommend called Venture Deals. It's actually like a Wiley textbook, but it reads more like a Guardians of the Galaxy satire. It's very, very good. You can get it on Amazon. If you are ever fundraising, this is a book that you need to read. I keep it on my desk. I reference it multiple times a week. It kind of talks through the mechanics of term sheet and, kind of what capital strategies can look like. And I think the subtitle is How to Be Smarter Than Your Venture Capitalist and Your Lawyer, which we all want to be. Another piece of advice here on kind of capital strategy or capital efficiency is to stay incubating in the university ecosystem as long as you can. until Bob kicks you out, probably. But this is really important. There's a lot that comes with being in the university ecosystem, from, kind of a low-cost rent, hopefully, the ability to collaborate, to go after non-dilutive funding, and just clout, an opportunity to be, connected to capital in a way that you might not have if you kind of sever those ties. So I always tell people to stay in the incubator space or in the university ecosystem as long as they can. Sorry for the language, but I also think you need a badass team. And I really mean that. Having the right team is what I would attribute a lot of my success to. You need a team that is motivated to solve hard problems that don't have right answers in the back of the book. That's what my tagline. There's no solutions key to bringing the next, first-in-class drug-delivering intermedullary nail system to market. We are figuring it out as we go, and you need a team that is motivated to solve those hard problems, and you need to motivate and incentivize them. This goes back to, a fear of a lot of founders of taking on too much dilution, but if you're not motivating and incentivizing your team with equity, you're gonna run into a place where you're gonna start losing your team, and you want them to participate in the upside and be motivated by that in the same way that you are. So a recommendation there is Good to Great by Jim Collins. That's an amazing book. I also keep that on my desk, about being a leader and building and motivating teams. And then a last piece here is resilience. I think this is something that a lot of us know. You've got to be gritty. And Angela Duckworth talks about this in her book, Grit, which I also recommend and also keep on my desk. This is hard, and it's not supposed to be easy, and it doesn't really get easier. What I've come to find is that what you thought was really, really hard before, 6 months later becomes easy, but then you just tackle a new set of problems that probably are a lot harder than the ones that you thought were hard 6 months ago. And that's what it is to be an entrepreneur and to kind of persevere, be resilient through these challenges. So that's my formula for success. Hopefully that's helpful. Hopefully some of these books are helpful to you all as well. Definitely listen to How I Built This. If you don't, it's very inspirational. And thank you for being here.
Cambre, that was awesome. Thank you. We're going to take some questions. There are microphones, as usual, going around. We've got one right up here from Guy. There's some water if you need some.
Cambre.
I think you're on.
Yeah, great talk. I mean, I did not realize that Reselute was formed because of NSF rejection. That's kind of funny because Pandora also have the same thing. And NSF also reject us because we got something else. They say, oh, we are fine, you don't need more money, kind of thing. Yeah. Well, the difference is I did not form Pandora 2 for that, but yeah. So my question for you is that seems that your Reselute is a slightly different technical background from your previous experience. But do you feel that you're kind of out of your comfort zone into something new that is not what you're traditionally doing? Because drug is probably more chemistry based than mechanical based. How do you feel about that?
I think it is now.
How about now? Yes?
Yeah.
Cool. Thank you, Guy, for the question. Yes, Reselute is definitely outside of my wheelhouse of technical expertise. I've had the opportunity of learning a ton of chemistry. So our Chief Technology Officer, Fielita Kessler, is also a bioengineer by training, but worked in inorganic systems and has more of kind of a chemistry materials background. We also have a principal chemist on our team, Jai Yu, who is one of the most detail-oriented and incredible researchers that I've ever worked with. And so they have indulged me asking what probably sounds like intro to freshman chemistry questions nearly constantly to help me get kind of educated on our formulation and our system and how do we wrap IP around that and what makes it differentiated and why does it do what it does. So for me, it's been extremely exciting to kind of learn this new space. You know, what I've brought to the team is my deep regulatory and clinical experience, as well as the ability to kind of operate and fundraise for a startup, right? So I think, again, going back to that comment on having the right team around you, you know, as a founder, you know, entrepreneur, CEO, you're not going to be the best at everything. And I think having the ability to kind of look in the mirror and say, where are my strengths? And how do I hire and build a team around me that fills in the gaps that I know I have is an incredibly important attribute.
Along those lines, while the microphone's getting passed, could you, I got this thing, I think I'm on, right? Yeah. Could you, I know it happened at different times, but could you compare and contrast fundraising for Resolute versus Restore 3D?
Yes, so Restore 3D, again, maybe a piece of luck that I didn't mention, really benefited in our early fundraising rounds from the exit of Vertera and MedShape. So I mentioned Vertera exited in 2017. We founded Restore 3D in July of 2017. And then ultimately MedShape exited in 2021, where we serendipitously timed another round of financing. And so again, to the comment that I made before, where returning shareholder value is an important piece of success, is that rain cycle. And so one thing, I'm not a tax expert or a tax lawyer, so this is not tax advice. We have what's called qualified small business stock in our businesses, and so you can roll over QSBS proceeds into another qualified small business tax-free. And so at the time of both Vertera and then MedShape's exit, we had a lot of investors that had come into those businesses that really believed in what we were doing and wanted to double down and invest in the next thing. And so Restore 3D benefited in those early rounds from a lot of qualified small business rollover, as well as the support of Duke Capital Partners, which is Duke's angel investing fund. And yeah, we were really, really, really fortunate there. We financed Restore 3D with kind of angel money up until our most recent round, where we took in our first kind of institutional capital. And so that puts another kind of lens on the way that you operate and run a business. So it's something that founders need to think about, is kind of who's in your cap table, not, they're writing you a check, but now they are involved and tied to your business. And how are you going to operate the business differently when they're in the boardroom if they also take a board seat? For Resolute, we have raised angel money up to this point. We've raised a much smaller amount than Restore 3D has. But the way that we think about it at Resolute is, what's our next de-risking milestone? When you talk to investors, it's all about de-risking the technology. What's the next, design freeze, regulatory submission, clinical endpoint, commercial milestone that you're meeting? And how do you tie your valuation step-ups as you raise more money to offset dilution with the capital that you need to get to the next milestone, and really think about it from that lens.
Danielle?
Hi, Cambre. Thank you so much for that really informative talk, really inspirational. I wanted to ask a little bit more about the indications for use of the antibiotic delivery technology. And is this indicated for any complex fracture? And if so, are you concerned about antibiotic resistance? Because there is a not insignificant percentage of fractures that aren't going to go on to infection, and yet there are no doubt going to be some bacteria there, and so just curious about. And I know that these are really complex studies, and there's lots of questions surrounding this. So, just curious about how much thought you've given to that.
A lot of thought. This is one of FDA's biggest concerns, and
Yeah.
so we've given a lot of thought to that risk, and how do we ultimately, design a system that isn't going to solve one problem and introduce another. And so to answer the first part of your question, the indications for our upcoming clinical trial are high-risk open fractures, so also known as compound fractures. It's where I hope nobody in this room ever needs the implants that we're developing at Resolute, by the way. The bone is coming through the skin, right? So you have a contaminated wound. And the current clinical standard of care, as I mentioned before, is kind of off-label local antibiotic depots. So surgeons are using PMMA bone cement or other calcium sulfate-based bone void fillers, off-label, mixing their own antibiotics in and putting them locally. Or what they'll do is take a vial of vancomycin or tobramycin that's meant to be reconstituted for IV injection, and they call it fairy dust, and they dump that into the wound bed, right? So we're already doing local antibiotic delivery in these patients, particularly these high-risk fracture patients. Our thesis here is that the sustained and controlled delivery of antibiotics from our system is actually going to improve the antimicrobial resistance issue, particularly with the delivery of tobramycin, which is a time-dependent antibiotic as opposed to a dose-dependent. And so when you dump, a gram of tobramycin into the wound bed, it's metabolized in 24 hours. It's not really sticking around long enough to kind of kick into gear and have that time-dependent kill profile that you want to have. So we've done a lot of kind of systemic serum levels and the multiple animal studies that we've done to show that we're not getting to toxic systemic levels to cause systemic toxicity or nephrotoxicity or hearing loss, which is a common side effect of aminoglycoside toxicity. And then thinking about our AMR, antimicrobial resistance strategy, and working very closely with some infectious disease specialists that are experts in this space to make sure that our release profile is one that's not, kind of contributing to that risk, actually mitigating.
Hey, Cambre. Great talk. Great to see you again. My question is more along the lines of additive manufacturing and its ability to engineer very complex solutions. The idea from how you guys walk through the most important criteria for functional healing, I'm curious, is it worth considering something other than the gyroid as a geometry?
We have looked at a lot of geometries, and we have put the gyroid through a lot of tests, and we can't find anything that it's bad at. And maybe we're inside our own echo chamber, but there is something about the kind of sheet-based architecture that, from a fatigue standpoint, is superior. I mentioned the isotropy for what we're doing at Restore 3D with the patient-specific design is a massive value add for us. But I think, as scientists and technologists, we're always open and agnostic to the technology. Maybe not looking at different lattice structures, although I'm always interested to see what else is coming. But with our printing technologies, even we've evolved from single laser systems to, we switched to a different manufacturer for a while. We're now using quad laser systems. And so we're always trying to kind of evolve what we're doing, at Restore 3D with technology. It's evolving as well. But we put a lot of energy and effort into the gyroid, and we like it a lot.
Related to Restore, as you said, it's getting a lot of attention now as a star student out there. But it was great for you to show the early days and the revenue. What happened between 2023 and 2024 where it went from this to that?
Yeah, really good question. So we started doing our first cases in 2018, and those were we used the custom device exemption, which is a pathway through FDA to provide solutions there's no other commercially available solution for. And so that was our earliest days. And we started bringing products through 510K and offering kind of more, primary solutions as well. So kind of two things happened at that kind of, maybe stepwise inflection point in 2024. One was we had made an acquisition of a business called Kenos Medical, which was a total ankle arthroplasty platform in 2022, I believe. We brought that technology in. It was not 3D printed. It needed kind of some additional product development to be done, and that took us about 2 years. So that solution really got kind of released into the market in its full embodiment in 2024, and we saw a ton of market pull for the technology and growth out of that product line. And then the other thing that happened is Restore 3D acquired a business called Conformis, which was actually a publicly traded orthopedic company that was doing patient-specific total knee and total hip arthroplasty. We took that business private and started integrating it. And so a big part of that step up was kind of the inorganic growth of acquisitive growth, if you will. But very similarly to what I mentioned with the Kenos platform, we took their technology, patient-specific arthroplasty, amazing vision and products, but they were not 3D printed. And so they were extremely unprofitable. So they were actually 3D printing wax castings and then investment casting the patient-specific implants and then doing a handful of subsequent post-processing operations. And so our thesis in making that acquisition was we could directly 3D print the implants and drastically improve the margin for that patient-specific implant, and that's what we set out to do and very quickly kind of proved out that thesis. So the combination of kind of internal development and those products kind of growing, the Kinos acquisition and that product really becoming mature to the point that the growth took off, and then adding the Conformis products into the portfolio, which really rounded us out as this kind of patient-specific arthroplasty company that we have become known for. It's kind of culmination of a lot of things.
Hi, Cambre. It's great to see you again. First of all, huge congratulations on this really ambitious venture. I also study open tibia fractures and fracture-related infection for my dissertation, so this is very near and dear to my heart, and maybe you'll permit me a little bit of an in-the-weeds question. So when I go to these conferences that involve more surgeons like OTA, this is a huge emerging problem. There is a recognition, it seems, that fracture-related infection is certainly not getting better and maybe is even getting worse as the salvage rates improve. One thing we encounter sometimes when talking, particularly with the best surgeons that we have the privilege of working with, is there's this understanding that fries are very, very pervasive, but maybe not in my practice, right? There's a little bit of a,
Yep.
there's maybe a thought that it comes from the surgical approach less so than the initial severity or state of the injury. So I guess my question is twofold. One, have you encountered any of that when working with surgeons, a reluctance to use this as like a first line product? And also, have you considered exploring this for revision procedures as well?
Really good question. Yes, there's certainly, we've encountered a lot of that, not only in trauma, but in extremities and joints, right? Surgeons say, oh yeah, infection rates are crazy and they remain unchanged, but I never see an infection, right? That's very, very common. I think the surgeons that we've kind of chosen to partner with that are primarily in a kind of an academic practice are oftentimes the referral centers as well. And so they recognize that, yes, surgical approach and technique are a part of that, but also they're maybe seeing a disproportionately high rate of infection relative to some of their peers because of having that kind of referral practice. You know, and ultimately some of that hesitancy and just a lot of kind of unknown about what's going on in FRIs and in PJI is what led us into the open fracture indications as kind of our beachhead. It's, you know, I've not run into somebody that would disagree that the open fracture rates are a problem and that a more preventative prophylactic solution is the right option for these patients. And so I've not really encountered surgeons that say, I wouldn't want to use this for all of my open fractures, because we don't also know who's going to be the one that develops the FRI, right? And I know you guys are doing some stuff to try to maybe help understand who will be those patients, but right now surgeons are just clamoring for a better solution, not only from an outcome standpoint, but from a clinical workflow standpoint as well. What they're doing, they're MacGyvering these chest tubes, cement-coated nails on the back table that are a pain in the butt. It takes 45 minutes for that PMMA nail to kind of fully set up. It's very clinically disruptive to their OR workflow as well, so they want a kind of a better workflow solution as well.
Well, we're at the end of the hour, so I think we'll wrap up. We do have coffee and so forth out in the atrium so people can continue to ask questions of Cambre. But thanks so much for sharing
Thank
your
you.
story. So inspirational what you've done, but so much more to come too. So thanks, Cambre.
Thanks, guys.